Hi, I'm John.
And I'm Lou, and this is a hot take.
So, all right, Lou. Yeah, things are weird right now. What we want to talk about today is resiliency of cloud services. And we've seen some outages recently and over the last several months that has me concerned about whether the cloud providers are taking resiliency seriously. And when back in the day when I worked at EMC, and we used to really tout resiliency back then. And data centers, the good, strong data center had 5 nines of resiliency. So what 5 nines of resiliency means is that you can have up to just over 5 minutes of an outage per year. Means you're up the rest of the time, 24/7, 365, and you're allowed 5 minutes of outage. And if you break that, then there's all kinds of SLA things. And if you're a hosted data center, then you owe money back to people or some other type of remediation. Now Lou checked, and Amazon touts what, 4 nines?
They're 4 nines, and that would equate to about a little under 53 minutes of downtime per year.
So let's call it an hour.
Yeah, an hour is reasonable. And if you were to get to 3 nines, it would be about 8 3/4 hours of downtime a year.
Work day.
The thing is, we worked. I got into, like you were at EMC, I was at Cisco at Juniper working on service provider stuff. 5 nines was like table stakes.
Yeah,
that was table stakes, and if you couldn't hit that, they weren't even going to talk to you.
Yeah.
So the question I have, based on this, is,
let me talk about the outages that we've seen recently.
What have we seen?
So last week, Microsoft 365 service, so this is on Monday, June 16th, they had an issue that affected their core applications that included Microsoft Teams and Exchange. So Outlook and all your mail services. So it left people globally unable to access the collaboration and communication tools, which may or may not be a critical service depending on the company. So I think there are companies out there that would heavily rely on these. I mean, if it's a corporate, you just keep doing email. But
did it knock down Teams?
It did. It knocked down Teams and Exchange.
So the problem is, if knocking down Exchange is actually a problem, but knocking down Teams probably made people feel better.
Well, there is that. But if you are in the middle of a mission critical situation and you need to communicate, then this is going to be a problem.
So how long?
Now, they were out for a few hours.
Whoa.
So that right there breaks the 4 nines, and it's not the only Microsoft outage, and it's actually not the only incidents. Just in the last 30 days, IBM Cloud services was disrupted twice. Google Cloud had an outage that impacted 50 services globally, and that impacted Cloudflare, which then impacted others. So on Thursday, a week and a half ago, I was trying to log into StreamYard, which is the tool that we use for podcast recording, and I couldn't get in. Well. Now, luckily, we had actually recorded the day before, and I was going in for something else. But, if I had needed to record, then I would have been delayed. Now, this podcast isn't critical to the survival of or to a mission critical situation, but it would have been impacting my job. But imagine now I'm an emergency services worker, and I need to get access to Teams and talk to my colleagues. Then I got to find backup.
That outage probably, even if you had a 5 nines SLA, that outage probably would have impacted you. And the challenge becomes, so many web services are intertwined on other web services that a cascading failure of one element that your cloud provider maybe doesn't control, like Cloudflare, for example, can turn into a much nastier situation.
100%. Now, here's what I think's happening. I think that we're seeing a lot of applications that are running in the cloud that are not actually cloud native applications. I think what we're seeing, and I'm going to take Exchange as an example, and here's what I'm assuming is happening. So I'm going to qualify that this is an assumption. We're guessing right now, is that the on-prem version of Exchange was then virtualized and then eventually migrated to the cloud. And I don't feel that it was migrated as a cloud native application. By cloud native, what I mean is that it's built 100% on microservices architectures, meaning that the authentication piece is one bit of code and there are multiple instances of that running. So if one goes down, another one takes over, and that the network transmission of the protocol is another service, and the encryption is another service, and the access to the data repository is another service. And all of these can come and go and get upgraded individually. Now, Lou and I used to work at a company that had cloud tools, and it was 100% microservices architecture. And they would make an argument, and I'm not making this argument, but they were making the argument that over a 3-year period, they had 0 outages with thousands and thousands of users, millions of devices being managed, and they had 0 outages. So, and they referred,
I never had a problem logging into it.
yeah, and they referred to it as infinite nines, and that was their marketing pitch around that. Now, they had to be careful because if they ever did have an outage, then that would completely ruin it.
Yeah, I was not ever truly
But
with that.
but the thing is that it works. So it is possible to build an environment. Now, the question is something as massive as Exchange, you're not going to migrate that to microservices overnight.
Well,
but it also hasn't been. I'm sorry?
There's another challenge here with this. Exchange in particular. Exchange was explicitly built to take advantage of whatever the version of the COM architecture is on Windows. Right. So it's almost certainly a native Windows application. And Windows does not have a robust containerization system.
Correct.
If you want to do containers in production right now, you need to be running on Linux. So a question I have for folks out there watching us be annoyed about this is, do you have any knowledge of this? Have they tried porting this over, or did they get a microservices architecture? So last time I checked, Windows wasn't, there was an experimental container application for it, but it wasn't judged production ready.
Well, but I mean, that would be the problem. If they are trying to run these massive environments on some flavor of Windows in the cloud, that's a mistake. They shouldn't be doing that. They should be building.
I agree, but that's been their bread and butter for how many years?
Yeah, right. But I mean, when the whole changeover happened and new leadership and all that, we want to become a cloud company. You gotta be thinking as a true cloud company. So now, and again, I'm not just bashing on Microsoft. Google had an outage as well.
No, everybody's having problems with this.
Right. So this is an overarching issue. And part of the message and why we wanted to talk about this is for those of you that are either in the process of migrating to cloud from an on-prem solution, or you are considering it, and whether that's your own home-built tools or it's a third party, you should do your due diligence and find out what their architecture is. How does it actually work? Because if it's a mission critical application that needs to be up and you need a certain SLA, you need 4 nines or you need 5 nines, then you need to understand what that how that application was architected. Because if it's not a microservices architecture, if it's some sort of monolithic structure that is effectively an on-prem system that was ported to virtualization and then ported to cloud, you're going to run into problems. Don't
do that with applications unless you can afford to have them go down.
Right. And then make sure that that SLA is in writing and that you know what that means. So, I've had internet outages at my home, and the remediation is, we'll give you $4 off your next bill or whatever. I couldn't give a rat's patootie about the $4. I'm upset that I lost a day of internet access. I couldn't get work done. $4 doesn't make a dent in my being pissed off.
Well, and there's one other fact you need to look at here, right? We've discussed how third-party applications could impact your cloud system that you have. Say you have an SLA for 5 nines with Microsoft Azure. If you have an upstream dependency on Cloudflare, you need to go talk to them as well.
Or make sure that Microsoft is in communication with Cloudflare, and that's included in the 4 nines or 5, I guess in this case 4 nines, because that's part of the chain of availability. And if it's Akamai that's got the problem, if it's Cloudflare that's got the problem, or any other intermediary, then, I mean, they can't really do anything if Comcast has an issue to the last mile to the user. That's not an outage for Exchange. But I would argue that an outage in Cloudflare is an outage for the service that you're.
Well, if your user cannot get to the service, if none of your users can get to the service,
there you go.
You have an outage. If
Right.
you have partial failure due to routing issues or content distribution issues, you could make some arguments that that is a partial outage. Well, it's obviously a partial outage, but maybe you need to think about it in your plans. Maybe when you specify 5 nines, not only do you specify 5 nines, what regions have to have that?
That's
right?
a good point.
What subnets are you coming from, or networks are you coming from, or providers are you coming from, say in an area like Comcast or something like that, which allows you to trickle down your SLAs to a much more granular level. The problem is having to think about this way eliminates a lot of the simplicity of moving to the cloud, right? You have to think about the architecture of your microservices. You have to think about what they count on, what you may have external dependencies for your microservices. So you got to make those, you got to nail those down. Then you got to know the architecture of the cloud well enough to understand what third-party systems they're depending on, and you got to go nail them down. And then if you absolutely have to get to some users, like say you have a CEO that works from home a lot or a CIO, they gotta be able to get to this thing.
Yeah.
So we're not saying cloud services suck. They don't. They scale enormously, but they have some hidden challenges that you
100%.
have to pay attention to.
Now, I'm going to throw one more twist into that, because one of the ways you provide resiliency in cloud services is by having multiple regional data centers. So that if I'm, in the Northeast of the United States and the Google data center that's closest to me has a problem, I should be able to route to another one in the Southeast or the West Coast. Maybe the performance isn't as great. Maybe my latency goes up a little bit, or my bandwidth goes down a little bit, but at least I still have access to it. Where that can actually become a problem, though, is if you think about certain privacy regulations like GDPR, where then they lock your data in specific areas. So if you're in Germany, your data is not supposed to leave Germany, especially if it has privacy implications. So then what do you do? If the German RDC goes down.
And then the question becomes how many RDCs are in a geographical area.
Right.
And that may, what you may end up having to do at that point is cross multiple clouds, right? Have one Amazon, one Google, or Azure and somebody else, or Rackspace, or whatever is available locally, which is really going to force you to genericize your container architecture
100%.
for your application.
So the end message for you is, if you are looking at those types of migrations, go in with open eyes, go in with the right personnel with the right skill set, whether that's a consultant that you're hiring or somebody on staff that knows all of these ins and outs and can help you with this. Going blindly into the cloud is a recipe for disaster. And by the way, it's going to be super expensive. Sticker shock after the fact is one of the biggest complaints about cloud services. Again, Lou and I are big fans of cloud, but if you just move a monolithic server from a physical or virtual domain on your data center and move it to cloud, it's almost guaranteed to be more expensive.
It will be more
expensive. Keep that in mind.
But it gives you other desirable benefits. The question, when you do this, it's not a default decision anymore. Given what's happened to the cost, you need to do an analysis of, say, having a primary and a secondary data center, and how much hosting you're getting, what bandwidth is costing, and what storage is costing, because it's getting very, very expensive in the cloud. So it's not a slam dunk anymore.
So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. That is going to cover this episode. And we couldn't do this podcast without listeners like you. We do want to hear what you think. Are we wrong? Are we off base here? Is it not as bad as we think? Or are you willing to give up the resiliency for the convenience of having a cloud environment? Or are you just the opposite? Are you just as upset from those outages we've seen recently from Microsoft and Google and Cloudflare and others. Send email to feedback@itsparkcast.com or hit us up on X @ITSparkcast. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below. We read every single piece of feedback and every comment that we get. We respond to most. And if it's particularly insightful, we will read it out on our Friday News Bites, and then you get to hear your name and your comments on that episode. Be sure to hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss any future episodes. And with that, we're going to turn you back to your day from the world of enterprise IT. Take care.
Thanks for letting us rant.